Chapter 11 of Finding a Way Out, an autobiography by Robert R. Moton. War Activities. The important position which Tuskegee had already acquired through its founder in matters affecting the interests of colored people led many persons, officials, and others to turn naturally in this direction for counsel concerning the attitude the Negro would probably assume regarding the war, and the best methods to be employed in securing his largest and best service to the nation in the conflict. The question was early raised as to how he would be affected by German propaganda, and whether or not he would fall an easy prey to the schemes of secret enemies of the government, and allow himself to become an accomplice of spies, plotters, and even bomb-throwers. I promptly assured all questioners that the Negro's loyalty could be depended upon absolutely at this time as in the past. My questioners in many instances pointed out the fact that the Negro had suffered a great many injustices in this country, and had long been deprived of many of the rights and privileges enjoyed by other American citizens, in view of which they were very apprehensive lest he should take advantage of this situation and join the enemies of the country in order to avenge his wrongs and secure the rights and opportunities due him as a man and an American. I reminded these anxious people that the Negro in America had always been loyal to his country, even when its acts were sometimes apparently to his disadvantage, and that in this conflict he saw and appreciated the issues at stake as clearly as any other elements in our population. It has sometimes surprised and even amused me to find white people worrying about the Negro's Americanism, assuming, as they probably do, that because he is black he must have some subconscious and subtle attachment for some other country. They forget that the Negro knows no more about Africa or any other country than these very same white people know about England or some other country from which their ancestors came to America. As a matter of fact, Negroes have been in America practically as long as white people. The Jamestown colonists arrived only 13 years ahead of them, and the Plymouth colony was founded about a year after the Negro arrived. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Negro should be as intense in his Americanism as any other part of our population, and in truth the nation has much less to fear from the approximately 12 millions of her Negro population than from many other groups whose advantages and opportunities would appear to be very much greater because of a more just attitude which our government has manifested toward them. It was in this connection that I wrote President Wilson as follows. I have not acknowledged your very kind letter of some weeks ago. A number of people of prominence have approached me with reference to the attitude the Negroes would assume in case the country should go to war. I understand also that certain high officials of the government have raised similar questions. Notwithstanding the difficulties which my race faces in many parts of this country, some of which I called to your attention in my previous letter, I'm writing to assure you that you and the nation can count absolutely on the loyalty of the mass of Negroes of our country, and its people, North and South, as in previous wars, will find the Negro people rallying almost to a man to our flag. Whatever influence I may have personally, or whatever service I can render in or outside of the Tuskegee Institute, I shall be glad to put at your disposal for the service of our country. The President replied, My dear Principal Moton, accept my warm thanks for your kind letter of the 15th of March, and allow me to tell you how deeply I appreciate your generous assurances. Tuskegee, of necessity, had to be very active in every line of war work. I felt that there was no better way to show the Tuskegee spirit or to perpetuate the ideals of Dr. Washington than to turn the full force of Tuskegee's resources and influence to the service of our country. The calls came in increasing volume, but no matter what the demands were, whether to give up some work or to set aside our regular routine, to conduct some sort of campaign, to journey a long distance to address an audience on an urgent war need, or to leave the school on short notice to meet with some committee, we gave freely and gladly of our time and efforts. When it became apparent that in the application of the draft the Negro would be expected to contribute his full quota of men to the national army, the question arose as to the desirability and advisability of establishing a camp for the training of Negro officers to command the Negro soldiers, similar to the one that had been previously established at Plattsburgh, New York, to which colored men were not being admitted. The weight of Tuskegee's influence was thrown into this proposal, which was being strongly urged from many quarters, with the result that such a camp was authorized by the War Department and was established at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, with Colonel C.C. Ballou in command. There was a fear, however, on the part of colored people that Negro soldiers would be called upon to serve only in what was designated as service and pioneer regiments, commonly known as labor units, with the possible exception of the comparatively few Negroes who were in the National Guard regiments of several northern states and the 4 regiments of Negro soldiers in the regular army. Accordingly, it was urged upon the War Department that in justice to the Negro it was desirable to have at least one complete Negro division for combat service, officered throughout by colored men, the hope being that Colonel Charles Young would command it. He is at present the only Negro graduate of West Point in the service of the regular army, and his record for efficiency is among the best in his grade. In this connection, I was requested to come to Washington for an interview with the Secretary of War. Arriving there, I was joined by Mr. George Foster Peabody, and together we urged upon the Secretary of War the wholesome effect which such a measure would have in strengthening the confidence of the colored people throughout the country in the purpose of the government to be impartial in its attitude toward Negro soldiers. The Secretary was interviewed also by Dr. George W. Cabanis and Mr. F.E. DeFrance and many other colored and white men of influence. Shortly thereafter, the order was issued for the organization of the 92nd Division of the National Army to be composed entirely of Negro soldiers, with Negro officers in the line. It was a great disappointment to colored people generally, however, that Colonel Young was not given the command of this division, but the War Department, on the advice of the Surgeon General's office, took the position that Colonel Young was physically disqualified for the service. Consequently, the command of this division was given to General Ballou, who had been strongly in favor of such a unit. It was my privilege to visit the various units of Negro soldiers at many of the training camps during the progress of the war. I recall with some satisfaction the 2 days which I spent with the 1,200 men of the officers' training camp at Fort Des Moines, who for the most part were students from educational institutions and professional men, along with about 200 men who had been selected from the 4 Negro regiments of the regular army. Tuskegee, like other institutions, furnished its full quota of the men who volunteered for this training camp. Altogether, more than 40 of our men, teachers, graduates, and students, received commissions at the end of their course, and most of them saw service in France. I never saw a finer body of men, and was particularly interested to learn from General Ballou that his surgeon had reported that of the 1,200 men in the group, only 5 had been found on examination to show any signs of social diseases. I doubt if any other camp anywhere could show a better record in this respect than this camp of black men. Growing out of these and similar experiences, it occurred to some of us that, in view of the frequent occasions for conference with governmental officials concerning matters pertaining to colored people and their part in the successful prosecution of the war, it was highly important to have in Washington, and preferably in the War Department, a wise and capable colored man who could advise the Secretary in such matters as concern the relation of Negroes to the various measures set in operation for the winning of the war. It was felt that in this way the government would secure the fullest cooperation of the colored people with the least amount of misunderstanding and friction. In a conference to which I had been invited by Secretary Baker, I made this proposal to him. The Secretary had impressed me as always desirous of being absolutely fair in all his decisions touching the interests of colored people, and on this occasion it was evident that he was anxious to do anything that would effectively aid in winning the war. After he had gone over the matter quite thoroughly with me, he arranged that I should have an interview with President Wilson. In this interview the President expressed his unqualified approval of the suggestion and asked who, in my judgment, might acceptably fill such a place, at the same time requesting me to take up the matter in detail with the Secretary of War. On taking up the matter with Secretary Baker, I proposed Mr. Emmett J. Scott as the man, in my opinion, who, by his long years of contact and experience with Dr. Washington in the handling of many delicate matters of public interest, was best fitted to advise regarding the many and varied matters which were constantly arising. Accordingly, Mr. Scott took up the duties of special assistant to the Secretary of War, with offices at Washington, the trustees of the Institute heartily concurring in the arrangement. Thereafter he rendered most valuable service to the government throughout the war, and while his absence from the Institute hampered considerably the working of his office in the school, we were nevertheless glad to make a sacrifice which contributed so much to the effective service of the colored people in the war. The school would have suffered very much more, however, but for the very capable way in which the work of the Secretary's office was carried forward by Mr. Alban L. Holsey, who, as Secretary of the Principal, rendered very effective service not only in the Institute, but in avenues beyond the Institute in connection with various lines of war activity. While the matter of a representative of the colored people was under consideration, government officials were in a quandary over two very important questions, viz., whether Negro draftees should be trained in the South, and whether white and colored soldiers should be quartered in the same cantonments. It so happened that Dr. P. Claxton, U.S. Commissioner of Education, had called a conference of colored and white men interested in Negro education to meet in Washington and consider various aspects of Negro educational institutions as brought out by the report of the Phelps-Stokes Fund on Negro Schools, prepared by Dr. Thomas Jesse Jones, and which at that time had been but recently published by the U.S. Bureau of Education. It occurred to some of us that it would be wise for Secretary Baker to take advantage of this gathering to get the opinion and judgment of certain of these gentlemen as to the advisable course to pursue with respect to the question of the disposition of colored draftees in the cantonments. Accordingly, he asked a group of these gentlemen to confer with him regarding the entire situation. Among those present were Bishop George W. Clinton, Mr. Oswald Garrison Villard, Dr. James H. Dillard, President John Hope, Major Allen Washington, Commissioner T. H. Harris of Louisiana, Mr. George Foster Peabody, and Dr. J. E. Moreland. It was a very illuminating conference. The Secretary asked for a frank expression from almost every individual present, and after some discussion, the sentiment of the body was happily expressed by Mr. Harris of Louisiana, who told the Secretary of War that he thought the best thing to do was to treat the Negro soldier just as he would treat any other soldier in the United States Army. Put him anywhere, he said, and exact of him the same service, and mete out to him the same penalties for misbehavior that would be given to any other soldiers. This, in his opinion, was the way to get the best results from black and white soldiers alike, and to keep the morale of the country at the highest point of efficiency. While the Secretary did not commit himself, subsequent events showed clearly that this policy was adopted by the War Department, and with very satisfactory results. As the war progressed, the problems of labor throughout the country grew more acute. Here, too, it seemed that the interests of the Negroes, as well as of the entire country, could be best served by having in the Department of Labor an assistant to the Secretary who would serve the department in very much the same way that Mr. Scott was serving the War Department. The National League on Urban Condition among Negroes, with which I was connected as an officer, took up the matter with the result that Dr. George E. Haynes of Fisk University was asked to take up the work with the designation of Director of Negro Economics. This service of the Urban League was only one of the many increasingly helpful measures set in operation by this organization in the interests of Negro advancement. Dr. Haynes himself rendered very valuable service to the department, as was to be expected, and it was the purpose of Secretary Wilson to continue him in the department after the war was over, but this was not possible because of the failure of Congress to renew the appropriation for this branch of the service. At Tuskegee Institute, the demands of the war made serious inroads upon our staff of workers, especially in lines of activity calling for efficient workers in other than military service. In all such cases, we were willing, in spite of inconvenience, to release members of our own force for such work whenever it was apparent that they could be of larger service in connection with war movements outside the Institute. In the production and conservation of food, I felt that Tuskegee should use every possible means to stimulate the colored people, especially in the South, to their utmost in helping the government, not only by intensive and extensive methods of farming, but also by putting in a full week's work instead of taking the usual Saturday holiday so common in the rural districts of the South. We were glad, therefore, to release Mr. E.T. Atwell, our business agent, for service with the U.S. Food Administration to direct this campaign among colored people in the Southern states. In the same way, the Institute later released Mr. Joseph L. Whiting, head of the Division of Education, for educational work overseas with the YMCA, Miss M.A. Suarez, librarian, for service with the same organization in France, the Reverend G. Lake Imes, dean of the Bible Training School, for service with the General Wartime Commission of the Churches, and Major J.B. Ramsey, commandant, for War Camp Community Service in Washington. The very excellent service rendered by Mr. Scott, Dr. Haynes, Mr. Atwell, and others appointed by the government, including Dr. C.V. Roman in the Surgeon General's Department, strongly suggests how short-sighted has been the policy of the government hitherto in not making use of colored men as a part of governmental machinery, especially in such matters as have to do with colored people. It is also true, in my opinion, that local government has lost much in efficiency by failing to make use of the service of strong, intelligent colored men in the local community, who could wisely and helpfully assist in the affairs of government among their own people. I have no doubt whatever that crime among Negroes would be reduced at least 50% by the use of Negroes as policemen and deputies where Negroes reside in any considerable numbers. The Negro press was also found by the government to be a very helpful factor in the prosecution of the war. It stood almost solidly back of such men as were appointed by the government in all of their efforts for the country's good, and whatever happened, they were most loyal to the government, even when, as was sometimes true, they might have criticized with justification many of the things which took place. The attitude of these publications, numbering some 300 or more newspapers and magazines, was a very important factor in determining the attitude of Negroes on many questions growing out of the war, and their influence upon public sentiment among their own people is of growing importance. It is very apparent that white people in the country are taking this fact more largely into account in business affairs as well as in matters of general community welfare. Very early in the war, the government selected Tuskegee Institute as one of the institutions to give training along technical lines to certain groups of drafted men who, in contingents of 308 men each, were to be sent here for 2 months' training. The first contingent arrived on May 15, 1918, and the training of these men continued until October 1, when the last contingent was absorbed into the Student Army Training Corps. In all, we trained and issued certificates under government direction to 1,229 of these men. Most of them were sent overseas, where they were able to apply the technical knowledge received at Tuskegee Institute. We received many letters from these men after they went overseas telling how the training had helped them. Along with these direct contributions of men and equipment went the enthusiastic cooperation of the entire Institute community in the work of the Red Cross and the various Liberty Loan and Thrift Stamp drives, as well as loyal adherence to the wishes of the Food Administration. On the 2nd of December, 1918, at the request of President Wilson and Secretary of War Newton D. Baker, I went to France to look into conditions affecting Negro soldiers, many of whom were undergoing hardships of one kind and another. Secretary Baker said that he and President Wilson felt that my going to France would be encouraging to the men, and that the presence and words of a member of their own race would be particularly helpful in view of all the circumstances under which they were serving the nation, at the same time inviting me to make any suggestions that might, in my judgment, help the situation. In spite of pressing matters in connection with the Institute, I felt that it was the school's duty to do anything possible to help our Negro soldiers, and decided to make the trip. While in France, I visited nearly every point where Negro soldiers were stationed. At most of them I spoke to the men, and at each place I was most cordially welcomed by the officers and men. I also had the privilege of conferring with Colonel E. M. House, Bishop Brent, senior chaplain of the American Expeditionary Forces, General Pershing, and many other high officials of the American and French governments, all of whom I consulted with reference to the record which had been made by Negro troops, and received only words of very highest praise and commendation on their character and conduct in all branches of the service. During the late summer and early fall of 1918, there were a great many rumors in and outside of official circles in this country to the effect that morally the Negro soldier in France had failed, and that the statement sometimes made that the Negro is controlled by brutal instincts was justified. The report was current in France that the unmentionable crime was very common, and according to the rumors, Negro officers, as well as privates in all branches and grades of the service, were guilty of this crime. A letter I saw that had been written by a lady overseas to another lady in the United States stated that the writer had been told by the colonel of a certain unit, whose guest she was, that he would not feel it safe for her to walk, even with him, through his camp of Negro soldiers. Another letter from a high official in a very important position with the Negro troops overseas, written unofficially to a prominent official on this side, stated that in the 92nd Division alone there had recently been at least 30 cases of the unmentionable crime. Another rumor, equally prevalent and damaging, was to the effect that the fighting units, which were commanded by Negro officers, had been a failure. In other words, the Whispering Gallery, which was very active in France on most phases of life overseas, said that the 92nd Division, in which the Negroes of America took special pride, had failed utterly, that wherever they had been engaged the negro officers had gone to pieces, that in some cases the men had to pull themselves together after their officers had shown the white feather, and other statements of similar import. I went to France with authority to go anywhere and get any information from any source so far as the American Expeditionary Force was concerned. It so happened that I went on the steamer assigned to the newspaper correspondence, a steamer which was one of the convoy ships for the President's party, on which Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the Crisis, was also a passenger. Mr. Lester A. Walton, of the New York Age, Mr. Nathan Hunt, of Tuskegee, together with Dr. Du Bois and myself, occupied the same very comfortable stateroom. We had many frank and pleasant talks, both on the ship and in Paris, where we occupied opposite rooms in the same hotel. The subject that we discussed most often was, of course, some phase of the Negro question, always with a view to helping the situation. I was accompanied on the trips out from Paris, as well as at many interviews in Paris, by 2 colored and 2 white men, 1 white newspaper man, Mr. Clyde R. Miller, of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and Mr. Lester A. Walton, of the New York Age. I also asked to go with me Dr. Thomas Jesse Jones, of the United States Bureau of Education and the Phelps Stokes Foundation, and Mr. Nathan Hunt, of Tuskegee Institute. I realized that the mission was a delicate one, and that questions which I might ask and the things which I would say might probably be misunderstood or misinterpreted. My purpose, however, was to get at the facts and to stop untruthful rumors. In order to ascertain the facts, I made extended inquiries of all those with whom I came in contact. I asked many questions with relation to the conduct and character of the colored soldiers as compared with other soldiers. When I reached General Headquarters of the American Expeditionary Force, I found that a few days before my arrival, a young white soldier had been sentenced to be hanged for the unmentionable crime, but because of his previous good record in every other way, the sentence was finally commuted to life imprisonment. The opinion at General Headquarters was that the crime to which I have referred was no more prevalent among colored than among white or any other soldiers. From Chaumont we went immediately to Marbache, the headquarters of the 92nd Division. I asked the general then in command of this division about the prevalence of the crime in question. He said that it was very prevalent, and that there had been a great many cases over which he was very much disturbed. This statement was corroborated by conversation with 2 of his white staff officers who were present. I courteously asked if he would mind having one of his aides get the records. I said that I thought general statements were often very damaging, and that inasmuch as the reputation of a race was at stake, I was very anxious to get the facts in order to make an accurate report, and if possible to stop the damaging rumors which were becoming more and more prevalent in America, and were already prevalent in France, especially among Americans, including military circles, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Red Cross, and other organizations. When the records were brought in and examined, 7 cases where this crime had been charged were found in the entire division of more than 12,000. Of these charged, only 2 had been found guilty and convicted, and one of the 2 convictions had been turned down at General Headquarters. In other fighting units, as well as the units of the Service of Supply at Bordeaux, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, and other places, I made the same investigations. I interviewed American and French commanding officers. I talked as well with scores of American and French officials of lower rank. When the records were taken, as with the 92nd Division, the number of cases charged was very few, and the number of convictions fewer still. I likewise took much time with certain members of the Peace Conference and with Americans engaged in various branches of war activity in an effort to disprove and set at rest this awful slander upon the Negro race. I spared no pains or effort to do this, and it would appear from subsequent investigations on this side of the water and from reports which have come to me from overseas that the momentum of these damaging rumors perceptibly lessened. There was apparently no doubt in anybody's mind in France, so far as I was able to find out, among the French or the Americans, as to the excellent qualities of the American Negro as a soldier when led by white officers. There was also little question about the fighting record of 4 Negro regiments, the 369th, 370th, 371st, and 372nd, which had been brigaded with French divisions. But when it came to the 92nd Division, there was a subtle and persistent rumor in Paris and in other places in France, apparently substantiating the rumor which was prevalent in America. Only in France it was much more generally accepted as true, namely, that Negro officers had been practically a failure, and that it was a mistake ever to have attempted to form a division with Negroes as officers. I took a great deal of pains and care, as did also the gentlemen with me, to run down every rumor. We spent much time in and out of Paris, ferreting out every statement that came from the whispering gallery. We finally found that so far as the 92nd Division was concerned, only a very small detachment of a single battalion of 1 regiment had failed. Later, in talking with General Pershing in France regarding this story of the failure of Negro officers, he said that the probabilities were that any officers, white or black, under the same adverse circumstances that these men faced, would have failed. A few officers of the battalion were sent before a court-martial for a trial for having shown cowardice. Not all of them, however, were found guilty, and since then these cases have been reviewed by the War Department, and the President, on the recommendation of the Secretary of War, has disapproved the proceedings involving the 4 officers of the 368th Infantry convicted by court-martial abroad. After thorough investigation, the War Department issued the following statement with regard to this 1 battalion of the 368th Regiment. The 368th Regiment had not had battle experience prior to its assignment to the French brigade. It was expected to operate as a liaison organization, maintaining contact with combat forces on either side, but not itself as an attacking force. In the development of the battle, it became necessary to use the regiment in attack. The ground over which the 368th Regiment advanced was extremely difficult. It had been fought over and fortified for 4 years, and consisted of a dense belt of intricate barbed wire, through which in 4 years underbrush had grown, concealing the wire and making any advance most difficult. The section in which the regiment was engaged developed at times intense shell, machine, and rifle fire, and subjected those troops to a severe test. The regiment was not fully supplied with wire cutters, maps, signaling devices. This was in part due to the fact that the troops were serving at the time with the French, from whom the supply was finally received, the delay being caused doubtless by the hurried movement of the regiment and the assumption on the part of the French that it would be supplied from American depots, and on the part of the Americans that it would be supplied by the French, with whom it was serving, a misunderstanding explained only by the confusion and emergencies of battle. It was gratifying even then to find that the commanding general, who knew all phases of the affair, did not take this failure nearly so seriously as the rumor about it seemed to suggest. The facts in the case in no sense justified the common report. In talking with the commanding general at Le Mans, I referred to the fact that something like 15 Negro officers had been sent back as inefficient. He said to me, "If it is of any comfort to you, I will tell you this. We sent back through Blois to America in 6 months an average of 1,000 white officers a month who failed in one way or another in this awful struggle. I hope, Dr. Moton," he added, "that you won't lose your faith in my race because of this, and certainly I'm not going to lose my faith in your race because of the record of a few colored officers who failed." We talked with Colonel House, Mr. Ray Stannard Baker, Captain Walter Lippman, leading Y.M.C.A. workers, and many others. All assured me that they were glad to get the facts, and that, so far as they were able, they would stop the slanderous rumors concerning our Negro soldiers. I spoke to white officers in a number of places, at one place to 200 of them, and candidly stated the facts in the case. I raised the question if they did not think it was a good and fair thing to stop this rumor of the Whispering Gallery, which was defaming a race, which threatened to cut down the efficiency of Negro troops, and was, of course, putting America in a bad light before the world. Many of the difficulties and troubles among the officers and men of the 92nd Division, as well as other colored units, could have been avoided if we had had at General Headquarters in France a colored man to render the same wise, dignified, and efficient help as Mr. Emmett J. Scott, Secretary of Tuskegee Institute, so splendidly rendered in the War Department at Washington to both the race and the nation. President John Hope of Morehouse College, Atlanta, Georgia, who, under many and trying conditions, had done excellent work overseas in connection with the Y.M.C.A., felt this need very much. General Pershing would gladly have had such a man if it had previously occurred to any of us to suggest it. In almost every instance, I found the commanding officers open to suggestions with a view to relieving the needless embarrassment of the colored soldiers. I found in the service of supply that colored stevedores were working 12 and 16 hours a day, and sometimes more, which made it impossible for the Y.M.C.A. to do any effective work along educational lines with the thousands of colored soldiers in this branch of the service. I took this matter up with the commanding general, and within 3 days orders had been given to reduce the time of work to 8 hours. At several places the quarters of the colored men seemed unfavorably located. In various instances changes were soon made. I took up with care also, going to the source of the trouble, the matter of excluding colored women from France. Here again I found that there seemed to be no justification for the general exclusion of women of our race from overseas service. This I took up with the proper authorities, military and otherwise, and before I left arrangements had been made to send for more of our colored women and men also. The best Y.M.C.A. hut I saw from every point of view was the one where Mrs. W.A. Hunton, Mrs. J.L. Curtis, and Miss Catherine Johnson were located. There was here a very fine spirit of cooperation between the white and colored workers. Mr. Wallace, the manager of the district, whom I later met in Paris, was warm in his praise of Secretary Nichols, Secretary Whiting, Chaplain Ogletree, and other colored workers. I took the opportunity wherever it presented itself to speak to our men about the splendid record which they were making, and of the danger that would attend any failure on their part to maintain their record untarnished. I said, "The record you have made in this war of faithfulness, bravery, and loyalty has deepened my faith in you as men and as soldiers, as well as in my race and country. You have been tremendously tested. You have suffered hardships and many privations. You have been called upon to make many sacrifices. Your record has sent a thrill of joy and satisfaction to the hearts of millions of black and white Americans, rich and poor, high and low. Black mothers and wives, sweethearts, fathers, and friends have rejoiced with you and with our country in your record. You will go back to America heroes, as you really are. You will go back as you have carried yourselves over here, in a straightforward, manly, and modest way. If I were you, I would find a job as soon as possible and get to work. To those who have not already done so, I would suggest that you get hold of a piece of land and a home as soon as possible, and marry and settle down. Save your money and put it into something tangible. I hope no one will do anything in peace to spoil the magnificent record you have made in war. In the same way, I took advantage of many opportunities to speak to white soldiers, officers, and men about their duty to their colored comrades who were sharing with them the hardships of the war. I said in my talk, "These black soldiers, officers, and men have with you willingly and gladly placed their lives at the disposal of their country, not only to make the world safe for democracy, but, of equal importance, to make democracy safe for mankind, black and white. You and they go back to America as heroes, brave and modest, of course, but there is a difference. You go back without let or hindrance, with every opportunity our beloved country offers open to you. You are heirs of all the ages. God has never given any race more than he has given to you. The men of my race who return will have many unnecessary hardships and limitations along many lines. What a wonderful opportunity you have, therefore, and what a great responsibility for you to go back to America. Resolve that, so far as in your power lies, you are going to see that these black men and the 12 millions of people whom they represent in our great country, who have stood so loyally by you and America in peace and in war, shall have a fair and absolutely equal chance with every other American citizen along every line. This is your sacred obligation and duty. They ask only fair play, and as loyal American citizens, they should have it. I cannot conclude without again mentioning the heroic record of all of our men in France, especially the Negro officers, who, in spite of hardships and discrimination from sources which should have accorded them much encouragement, went into battle with dash, courage, and an absolutely unshaken and undisturbed morale. I do not believe that men of any other race, under similarly trying circumstances, could have retained more self-possession and made a more glorious record than did our Negro soldiers, officers, and men. I am glad that most of those from Tuskegee Institute have returned and taken up their work as before. We cherish, however, the memory of Lieutenant Henry H. Boger, one of our teachers who, with many other brave Americans, sleeps beneath the sacred soil of France. Before leaving France for London, President Wilson sent me the following letter: Paris, January 1, 1919. Dear Principal Moton, I wish to express my appreciation for the service you have rendered during the past few weeks in connection with our colored soldiers here in France. I've heard not only of the wholesome advice you have given them regarding their conduct during the time they will remain in France, but also of your advice as to how they should conduct themselves when they return to our own shores. I very much hope, as you have advised, that no one of them may do anything to spoil the splendid record that they, with the rest of our American forces, have made. Cordially and sincerely yours, Woodrow Wilson. End of chapter 11.